Yeah, so I'm really excited to be able to start off this discussion on trans inclusion in the classroom. What I'm hoping to do is share some of my thoughts and the thoughts of others who work in the field for sort of 15, 20 minutes, and then leave a lot of time for discussion, questions, points that may be useful to converse about. So as was mentioned, I have appointments in engineering in the School of Arts and Sciences and also in Penn School of Medicine. I'm a co-chair with Erin Cross of the LGBTQ+ Faculty Working Group, and I'm also currently a member of the Senate Committee on Faculty Development, Diversity, and Equity. I wanted to start by just mentioning this passage from Bell Hook's book, Teaching to Transgress, that I just recently read. I can't believe I just recently read it. It's so good. But where she writes that the classroom, with all its limitations, remains a location of possibility. And I wanted to start there because I wanted to think about how the classroom remains a location of possibility and a possibility of inclusion. And particularly what we're hoping to discuss today is the ways that we can think about possibilities for being more inclusive in terms of trans and non-binary students. But I also think that just the framing in general is important to think about the classroom as always changing, always open, always a possibility. So to begin, I wanted to set down a few terms so that the next few slides are going to make sense. So first, I'll use the word sex to refer to primary and secondary sex characteristics. So we will use words like female, intersex, or male in the sex umbrella. Under the umbrella of gender, we will be referring to socially constructed roles, behaviors, and expressions. And in particular, I wanted to make a distinction between cisgender people, so those whose gender more or less aligns with the sex they were assigned at birth, and then transgender people, so those whose genders do not align with the sex assigned to them at birth, or with the cis-normative expectations associated with that gender. I wanted to underscore the fact that the transgender term is, again, an umbrella term, and some common subterms in the white colonial culture in the US would include agender, androgynous, gender fluid, gender queer, non-binary, trans femme, trans masc, trans man, and trans woman. Examples in other cultures would include two-spirit, so particularly for Indigenous people, and travesti in South America. And that's just to underscore the fact that terms continue to change and grow, and cultures continue to share those terms with one another, and we learn more and more about what terms people are using who have similar or different experiences along these lines. I did want to note that these terms are conceptual tools, and an over-reliance on categories, even the category between cisgender and transgender, or dichotomies between those two, is overly simplistic and ignores the fluidity within and across categories. And the terms like cis then function as sort of a shorthand to recognize how gender organizes us. Some folks move more easily through these processes or hierarchies by conforming to hegemonic norms and practices, and others are subject to more discrimination under gendered regimes. So while I will be using cis and trans as distinct categories, I do want to underscore the fact that it's worth troubling that distinction as well. So I want to then turn to why talk about trans-inclusive policies and practices. And the first answer is that, number one, that's how we learn. So binary gender norms are ingrained in our minds. We often don't even know when we do or say something that might make a trans person feel unwelcome or uncomfortable. So talking about trans inclusion helps us to learn to see the world from the eyes of our trans students, our trans staff, and our trans faculty. And when we learn, we gain tools. So tools that we aren't born with, and tools that allow us to be more caring, kind, generous, and understanding of the experiences of others that may be different from our own. But there's a second reason for why, or second answer to why talk about trans-inclusive policies and practices. And that is that when students feel supported, they are successful. And I wanted to pull a couple passages from Jenny Beeman's paper, What is Needed, What is Valued? Trans Students' Perspectives on Trans-Inclusive Policies and Practices in Higher Education. So this is something that Jenny has been focusing on for a really long time in their scholarly work. And First, I wanted to note their passage where they say that trans students often experience avoidance or antagonism from faculty and other students, leading them to feel anxious, uncomfortable, and possibly threatened. Moreover, trans students nationwide report greater levels of harassment and discrimination, have a more negative perception of campus and classroom climates, and feel less accepted as part of the campus community than do cisgender students. Trans students also view the climate on their campuses as more hostile, so as less tolerant and less inclusive, and report a lower sense of belonging, for example, less acceptance and less integration within their campus community than cis students. Jenny and colleagues therefore underscores the need for higher ed faculty, staff, and admin to pay greater attention to the systematic ways in which college, university structures, and practices serve to privilege and uphold the gender binary, thereby rendering trans students vulnerable to negative personal and academic outcomes. And I put a couple references for each of these statements here so that in case you're curious and would like to read more, there are pointers to where to read more. So I want to then ask, what is a trans-inclusive policy? If there are two reasons to go about talking about them, what are some examples of trans-inclusive policies? And here I wanted to foreground the work of Perry Zurn, who's currently writing a book, How We Make Each Other, Trans Poetics at the Edge of the University. It's forthcoming from Duke University Press. And in the book, Perry focuses on unpacking the kinds of trans-inclusive policies that a university could focus on. Most of the work that's been done in universities thus far focuses on these first 5. And then on the next slide, I'll show you 5 more that are less discussed and where more work and effort is needed. So first, trans-inclusive policies often focus on a legal problem, which is solvable by the addition of gender identity and expression to college and university non-discrimination policies. The second focus is on a linguistic problem, solvable by name and pronoun sharing practices, as we'll talk about shortly, as well as software patches to registration systems for anything from classes to diplomas. A third problem that's commonly focused on is the facilities problem, which is solvable by offering gender-inclusive housing, bathroom, and locker room facilities. The fourth is a healthcare problem, solvable by extending insurance coverage to trans-related mental health care, hormone therapy, and gender-affirming surgeries, and increasing trans-competent staff of health and counseling services on campus. The fifth is an awareness problem, solvable by trans-specific programming, Trans 101 training workshops, and support for LGBT and/or trans-specific student organizations. In each of these cases, Perry underscores the fact that trans people are sometimes viewed as the problem, and that these solutions are sort of framed in that context. And he wants to juxtapose that that perspective with focusing on the places where trans people are precisely not the problem and where it's actually trans representation that's the problem and bringing trans people in. And the first on his list here is a curricular problem. So that is solvable by curricular representation of trans people or scholars, as well as distinctly trans pedagogies. The second is a collections problem, which is solvable by library representation of trans authors or trans studies and efforts to secure and build trans archives. The third is a personnel problem, which is solvable by purposefully recruiting trans students, staff, and faculty. The fourth is a research problem, solvable by supporting with time and money research done with, by, and for trans people. And the fifth is a community problem, solvable by integrating university engagement with local trans communities. With those 10 goals in mind, I think I want to focus just on the question of education now for the remainder of the talk. And I wanted to foreground work from Harper Keenan, who is a trans scholar who focuses mostly on K through 12 education, but I think a lot of his work is very relevant for the college period as well. And he underscores 3 guiding goals. The first is acknowledgement and becoming dialogic partners. He underscores the fact that preservation, prescription, and projection of normative binary gender continues all through schooling, from the very beginning up through high school and university schooling as well. Schooling is still a site of sorting and conditioning bodies into a system of binary gender, a system steeped in hegemonic whiteness for both its teachers and its students. Schools were not designed to support queer and trans people who defy imposed identity categorization. And therefore, our job as educators is to serve as dialogic partners with students in making meaning of those words for themselves and constructing new language and practice necessary for a less violent organization of our bodies in the world. He motivates us to ask 3 questions. What are the scripts that I have internalized about bodies in the world? Maybe about my own body, or maybe about the bodies of my students. How can I support my students in analyzing their own scripts? And third, how can I support students in imagining something different? The third goal that I want to pull out from his work on scripting curriculum in the Harvard Educational Review is listening to trans non-binary students. We need pedagogies, he writes, that concentrate more of our efforts on inviting people to be with each other in our full humanity. We need pedagogies that listen to transgender experience in all its forms. So I want to ask, what are our internalized scripts, and what are ways that we can listen differently and more? So first, on internalized scripts, I wanted to give now just many very concrete, very simple examples. So I'm going to turn from the theory and the motivation to very simple, concrete things. So first, let's say emails and bathrooms. You're writing an email to a group of students or staff or faculty or some mix of the above. A non-inclusive way to begin that email is to begin with the greeting, ladies and gentlemen. A more inclusive approach would be dear students, colleagues, all, hello all, greetings, folks, etc. So words that do not make any gendered assumptions about the people who will be receiving that message. Similarly, when walking a visiting student or colleague to or from an event, a non-inclusive thing would be to ask them if they need the ladies' room or to visit the gents. A more inclusive thing to do would be to offer information about the locations of all restroom types, all gender, women's, men's, at the beginning of the visit. More on bathrooms and pronouns. When a visiting student asks where the bathroom is, then a non-inclusive, maybe first instinctual thing you might do is to assume, for example, a masculine gender and then point them to a men's room, or to assume a feminine gender and then point them to the women's room. Instead, take a moment and say there are 3 nearby restrooms, or restrooms come in 3 flavors at Penn. The nearest is an all-gender restroom down the hall. The nearest men's room is down that hall, and then the nearest women's room is around the corner. That doesn't make any assumptions about the individual person and their gender, or which bathroom they would prefer to use. When speaking about a student in their presence, a non-inclusive approach would be to assume a gender and to use he, him, his, or she, her, hers pronouns. An inclusive way of speaking about a student in their presence is to use the student's name. So thanks, Dale. So-and-so, Dale's question was X. And I would suggest only using a pronoun if the student has told you which pronouns they would like you to use. If not, just using their name is the best practice. Now let's turn from these simple scripts that come out in emails and bathrooms to the classroom experience. So let's imagine you're walking into class on the very first day and it's time for introductions. When meeting your students, some non-inclusive things would be to read the roster out loud. Why is that non-inclusive? Well, because the names that are present on the roster may not be the name that the person has at the time and may be gendered in ways that the person is not currently gendered. A second issue would be assuming any student's pronoun. A third way of being non-inclusive would be to require all students to share their pronouns. And here I wanted to underscore the fact that some students actually are questioning, some students are in the process of coming out. For some students, the pronouns they'd like you to use are not aligned with their gender. And students, especially on the first day of class, don't yet know if this is a classroom where it is safe to be out or where they want to be out. And so it's really important, I think, to allow them space for that opacity and to invite them to share their pronouns, but not require it. So what can we do to be inclusive on the faculty side? One would be to share your name. Another would be to share your pronouns if you are comfortable. Again, see above, if a faculty member is questioning or not yet out, it is possible for them to instead choose to underscore their support of the pronouns of the students. And another inclusive thing would be to say, if you have pronouns that you would like me to use for you, please do tell me and your classmates. If you do not, that is also completely fine, and I will simply use their name. And that allows them to maintain whatever level of opacity they prefer. So again, on the first day, what can we do with the syllabus to ensure that trans students feel included? One option is to include what's called a diversity and inclusion statement at the very beginning of the syllabus. Here's one example, but they can come in many flavors. This one says, at Penn and in this course, we aim to educate and respect students with diverse backgrounds and perspectives. The diversity students bring to class is a resource and an essential feature of university education. We aim to present materials and activities that are respectful of diversity, including academic background, as well as gender, sexuality, disability, age, economic status, ethnicity, race, and culture. Importantly, your suggestions to improve the diversity and inclusivity of this course are encouraged and appreciated, and that gives some power to the students to provide additional feedback. The next two examples are taken from, adapted from, or inspired by a GSWS course 350 on trans method from Ava Kim and Davey. So this is a statement on names and pronouns that can be included in a syllabus. This one, for example, says, in our classroom, it's important that we refer to everyone by their names and by their pronouns. Pronouns can be a way to affirm someone's gender identity, but they can also be unrelated to a person's identity. They are simply a public way in which people are referred to in place of their name. In this classroom, you are invited but not required to share the pronouns you use or the pronouns you want to use in this particular space. And we ask that all of us commit to being attentive to and using each other's pronouns. If you accidentally misgender someone or use an incorrect pronoun for them, please simply correct yourself to their pronoun. If during the course you would like us to change the pronoun we are using for you, please let us know. Additionally, you can provide students with information about how to alter their name in the system. This has recently changed. So for a while, it was the case that trans and non-binary students needed to request special accommodation to change their name. But now it is possible for any student to go in and, and change their name inside of the system. It can be a cisgender student, a trans student, a non-binary student, anyone can go in and change their name inside of the system. There's also information here about how to change the legal name if necessary or desired, and information about exactly what place to go to make those changes. In addition to the statement on names and pronouns that provides some commitments as well as some information for the students, you can include a bathroom statement as well. So this is an inclusive thing to do. Here, for example, is the one that I use for my class. So it says, a multi-stall all-gender bathroom is located on the first floor of the neighboring building, the Veen. Single-use all-gender bathrooms on the second floor of Skirkanich Hall across from the main BE office. There are also additional single-use all-gender restrooms located in the same spots on the third and upper floors of Skirkanich Hall. And I also mentioned that there are two in Hayden Hall and mentioned that they're on the first floor and the third floor. I also mentioned that there are free sanitary products available in the all-gender bathrooms of the LGBT Center. So this provides students with information that they may not have already, and that helps them feel more included. Okay, so it's still the first day of class. You've finished introducing yourself and having the students introduce themselves, if that's what you do. You have finished working through the syllabus and you've gotten through some content, and now it's time for some discussion. So what are some inclusive and less inclusive things to do in the context of discussions? Something that's not particularly inclusive, but that I have heard and I think came from a hope of being inclusive is this one. So I want to hear from one man, then one woman, then one man, then one woman. I think the person who did this was hoping to be inclusive in the sense that they were ensuring that women would be speaking. However, there may be non-binary and genderqueer students in the classroom who do not identify as either man or woman, whether trans or cis. Another not inclusive thing to do would be to say, I need to hear from a female now. Let's hear a woman's perspective, turning to someone who looks a particular way. This is not inclusive because no one is entitled to order a person assigned female at birth to speak. Something that would be more inclusive and that I think channels what some of these faculty were hoping for is, for example, I would value more gender diversity in our conversations. I want to encourage folks in non-dominant gender positions to speak up. Another non-inclusive example would be making jokes about the boys discussion group and the girls discussion group. So it's not needed or relevant to the content of the class to assume genders of groups that are constructed in the course of discussion. Okay, so now the students have finished their first class and they're back at their dorm room. How can we be inclusive even when they're in their dorm room? Well, this I think brings up something that's very important, which is how inclusivity can be demonstrated or not demonstrated in homework. And I'm going to give some examples in the sciences and then in the humanities. So here, for example, is in the sciences, this is a non-inclusive homework problem. So approximately 1/3 of all human twins are identical. So 1 egg, and 2/3 are fraternal, 2 egg twins. Identical twins are necessarily the same sex, with male and female being equally likely. And that right there is a statement that should be altered to include intersex individuals as well. And then the passage goes on, continually assuming a binary sex and not addressing the gender of the students. The person who had one of these, a trans student who had one of these questions for their homework, voiced the concern, I have to pretend that I don't exist to get an A. And of course, that's troubling psychologically to a student. Similar examples are here. So the Smiths have 2 children, at least one of them is a boy. What's the probability that both children are boys? Also assumes a gender binary. Suppose that 5% of men and 0.25% of women are colorblind, and then go from there. A couple decides to continue to have a children until a daughter is born. This one assumes that there are always either sons or daughters. So what would be inclusive instead, so in contrast to those, would be how about we use some green and brown butterflies if you need problems with an N of 2, or better yet, construct homework problems with N genders where N is greater than 2, or better yet, you can tell I'm a scientist, ask them to approximate the answer as N goes to infinity. Now let's talk about a homework problem that one could come across, not in the sciences, but in the humanities. And this one was kindly given from Aaron Cross. So explain the strategy of the National Union of Mine Workers, men and women, during the miners' strike of 1984 to 1985 in Great Britain. And the person may be thinking that they are being inclusive here because there actually was a group called the Women Against Pit Closures. So they might initially be thinking I should include men and women in this question. However, again, it's assuming that all individuals at that time identified as men and women. So a more inclusive thing to say would be explain the strategy of people. So ungendered people, just people, in the National Union of Mine Workers during the miners' strike of 1984 to 1985 in Great Britain. Back at the dorm also, so after the student has finished their homework, they pull out their reading assignment so that they can be ready for the next day of class. What is a not inclusive thing to do in your assigned reading? Well, that would be to compose your readings predominantly of white, cisgender, heterosexual men. A more inclusive thing to do would be to balance your reading, and the famous scholars that you talk about among a variety of genders, sexualities, races, ethnicities, and many other dimensions of difference that I haven't listed here. I will note that there are trans scholars in all disciplines. You just need to look for them if you don't know who they are already. In this line, I did want to mention that there's important work that's being done in the sciences, and 2 recent articles that have come out from the 2 top journals in science, Nature and Science. The first one from Nature is called The Rise of Citational Justice, How Scholars Are Making References Fairer. And the second one from Science is that women researchers are cited less than men. Here's why and what can be done about it. And there's increasing evidence for the undercitation of scholars from marginalized races and ethnicities as well. And this is across a variety of fields of scholarship. But why I'm raising it here is that it is very relevant to how we construct our syllabi as well. And we can think about our citational practices in syllabi. Who are we citing? Whose ideas are we working with? Who are we putting in front of our students? And which individual scholars whose ideas are we grappling with? If we want to ensure that our syllabi are more equitable than they may be just sort of initially, there are a few things that you can do. You have the capacity to manually or algorithmically assess gender, race, and ethnicity distributions of authors of assigned reading. We actually have work where we do that algorithmically for very, very large databases. But if you're just working with a syllabus and a small number of references, it's easy to do this manually instead. You can also include something like a syllabus diversity statement. This is something that David Leiden-Staley in the Annenberg School of Communication is working on at the moment with other colleagues and collaborators. And that is to present information about the gender, race, and ethnic makeup of the references included in the assigned reading, and provide a statement of commitment to equity in those readings. And I think that that is a special and important way to think through presenting to students that these references have been carefully collated, not just to illustrate the diversity of ideas, but to illustrate the diversity of thinkers. Now, just to close, I want to move from classroom to dorm to world and think a little bit about trans inclusion at Penn. Everything that I've said so far is more general across all universities, but Penn actually has a larger number of trans and non-binary students than most universities. So at the moment, we have approximately 3% according to Penn's 2019 Student Health Survey, and that's in comparison to approximately 1.6% of the general US population. Interestingly, also, trans inclusion at Penn in the classroom is an issue, and that is evident from the LGBT Center's records. So they receive most complaints besides restrooms around gender-related classroom issues. So this illustrates that not only do we have a lot of trans and non-binary students, but also that there are many of the issues that they face revolve around the classroom. So that it underscores the need for us to do something. I also wanted to mention that you can't tell if somebody is trans by how they look. They look like everyone else who's not trans. So inclusion needs to be a way of life. It's not something that you can sort of put on like a coat in certain situations. It has to just be a way that you are. So thinking more about trans inclusion as a way of life here at Penn, I want to bring us back to the very beginning. Why talk about trans inclusive policies and practices? Well, for two reasons. That's how we learn and gain tools that allow us to be more caring, kind, generous, and understanding of the experiences of others that may be different from ours. And number two, when students feel supported, they are successful. Trans inclusion as a way of life. When I say that, I mean not just to have it be a way that we always are rather than a coat that we put on, but also recognizing that it is a stepwise process, that we can each take steps that are larger than the steps that we took before. There can be beginning, intermediate, advanced ways to make our interactions with students more and more inclusive. It doesn't happen overnight, and it's not something that we'll ever be done with. So I think accepting that process-related perspective is important. There's always something more to learn, and there are always more ways to be inclusive and welcoming. I wanted to close with this statement from Perry Zern, who's a trans scholar I mentioned earlier. If learning involves constantly digging more deeply into the complexity and mystery of the world around us, then trans inclusive education is just another step in that journey. So I'd like to thank the generous individuals who provided feedback on this set of slides. That includes Maria Murphy and Gwendolyn Beetham from GSWS, Sophie Lohman, who's a trans graduate student at Penn, Perry Zern, who's a professor of philosophy at American University, and Erin Cross, who's the director of the Penn's LGBT Center. I'm grateful for their input, but I do want to underscore that any errors, inaccuracies, or insensitivities that remain in these slides are, of course, my responsibility. So thank you so much for listening. I'd be very happy to open the floor back up for questions now, or comments or discussion.